He left her for being infertile. 6 years later, he saw her pregnant, and a little girl with his eyes cleaning the floor. 6 years ago, Oliver Hale sat across from his wife Catherine at their marble kitchen island in silence. The kind of silence that wasn't born of peace, but of something already broken. The evening sun filtered through the tall windows of their luxury Manhattan apartment, casting a warm light on cold surfaces. It should have felt like home, but it didn't. Not anymore. He had rehearsed his words all afternoon, pacing his office, rewriting the script in his head over and over. But when the moment came, he didn't use any of the carefully chosen phrases. Instead, he looked her in the eyes and said flatly, "You can't have children. This isn't the life I signed up for." Catherine blinked, barely moving. Her hands were wrapped around a mug she hadn't sipped from in 20 minutes. She didn't cry, didn't scream. She just looked at him the way someone looks at a stranger they used to know. She had gone through every medical test, every consultation, and every humiliating question. The diagnosis had been difficult, but she had accepted it with quiet strength. She thought he would stand with her. She thought love was stronger than biology. But Oliver was a man ruled by legacy. Business, wealth, bloodlines, everything in his world was built on the illusion of control and continuation. He had always envisioned a son to carry the name, a picture-perfect family to match his empire. Without children, he saw their future as a dead end. A failure. And failures didn't belong in his world. "I'm sorry," he added, though his tone lacked warmth. "I need to move on. I can't waste years waiting for something that won't happen." She didn't ask him to stay. She didn't beg. She had seen the moment coming, even if she had prayed she was wrong. That night, he packed his things. No argument. No breakdown. Just a door closing on 7 years of marriage. Oliver left like a man leaving a hotel room, without attachment, without regret. Or so he believed. What he didn't know, what neither of them knew in that moment, was that Catherine was already pregnant. She found out 2 weeks later, alone in a bathroom with a cheap pregnancy test shaking in her hands. At first, she thought it had to be a mistake. But 2 more tests confirmed it. A miracle, the doctor later called it. 1 in 10,000 odds. And yet, there it was, a heartbeat, pulsing defiantly on a blurry black and white screen. She thought about calling him. About giving him the chance to come back. But then she remembered the look in his eyes, the finality of his words, the emptiness in the goodbye. He hadn't left because of her diagnosis, he'd left because he saw her as broken. And someone who sees you as broken doesn't deserve to witness your strength. So she told no one but herself. And the child growing inside her. Catherine didn't have time to mourn. The reality of her situation unfolded rapidly, and it didn't care about heartbreak or betrayal. She moved out of their apartment before the end of the month, taking only what she could fit in 2 suitcases and a few cardboard boxes. The rest, the designer furniture, the jewelry, the wedding photos, she left behind. None of it belonged to her anymore. Not really. She used what little savings she had to rent a tiny 1-bedroom apartment in Queens. It was small, with creaky floors and water stains on the ceiling, but it was hers. Quiet, modest, and separate from the world she had just left. Her pregnancy was difficult from the beginning. The doctors warned her that the chances of complications were high. She was underweight, under stress, and alone. Still, she showed up to every appointment, hands gripping her coat tightly, never allowing herself to miss a checkup no matter how tired she was. She couldn't afford a car, so she took buses, often standing in the freezing cold or summer heat for long stretches. There were times when she fainted from exhaustion, when she threw up in public bathrooms, and when she cried herself to sleep from pain. But she never gave up. She found work cleaning offices at night. It paid poorly, but it was under the table and flexible, which meant she could survive and keep her pregnancy hidden. She didn't want questions. She didn't want pity. She wanted control, no matter how fragile. Sometimes, she'd work until 3 in the morning, her legs swollen, back aching, nausea pressing against her ribs, then sleep for a few hours before starting all over again. She kept the ultrasound pictures tucked into a worn envelope at the bottom of her drawer, like a secret prayer. Each time she looked at them, she reminded herself, "You're not doing this for him. You're doing this for her." When the time came, labor was long and painful. She delivered in a public hospital, alone, with no family or friends waiting in the hallway. But when the nurse placed the baby in her arms, a tiny girl with thick brown hair and deep brown eyes, Catherine knew she would go through all of it again in a heartbeat. She named her Sophie, a name that had lived in her heart for years, unspoken. Sophie meant wisdom. It felt right, like her daughter had arrived not just with innocence, but knowing more than the world gave her credit for. The first year was the hardest. The baby woke up every 2 hours. Formula was expensive. Diapers even more so. Catherine learned how to stretch every dollar, how to turn rice and beans into a week's worth of meals, how to shop with coupons, how to clean her entire apartment using vinegar and baking soda because she couldn't afford cleaning supplies. She returned to work just 6 weeks after giving birth, leaving Sophie with an elderly neighbor who agreed to watch her for a few hours a day. But as Sophie grew, so did their bond. Catherine talked to her constantly, not just baby talk, but real words, complete thoughts. She wanted her daughter to grow up hearing strength, not silence. By the time Sophie was 2, she could speak in full sentences. By 3, she was asking questions no one expected from a toddler. She was sharp, observant, and kind, always watching her mother with wide eyes full of wonder and empathy. Catherine often brought her along to cleaning jobs when she couldn't find someone to watch her. Sophie didn't complain. She followed her mother around offices, homes, and storefronts, watching how she scrubbed, how she worked with focus and care. One evening, when she was barely 4, she tugged on Catherine's sleeve and asked, "Mama, can I help?" At first, Catherine laughed. But Sophie insisted. She grabbed a tiny sponge and mimicked her mother's movements with shocking precision. That day, Catherine realized something both beautiful and heartbreaking: her daughter wasn't just watching. She was learning. About resilience. About sacrifice. About how to survive in a world that had offered them so little. Still, Catherine tried to shield her as much as she could. She told her bedtime stories every night, filled with magic and wonder. She created a tiny world in their cramped apartment where fairy lights glowed and handmade paper stars hung from the ceiling. On weekends, they went to the library and read books together for hours. She may not have been able to give her daughter luxury or stability, but she gave her something deeper: attention, intention, and unconditional love. Sometimes, late at night, when Sophie was asleep, Catherine would sit at the edge of her small bed and touch her daughter's forehead gently, whispering things like, "You're enough," and "You're going to be more than this." She wasn't sure if Sophie could hear in her dreams. But she hoped something would stick, that the words would root themselves somewhere inside her and grow strong, even if life stayed hard. By the time Sophie was 6, she was already mature beyond her years. She still had the soft cheeks of a child, but in her eyes was a quiet understanding that even adults often lacked. She never asked why they didn't have a car, why they couldn't buy new clothes, or why Catherine sometimes skipped dinner. She simply took her mother's hand in hers and helped mop a little faster. And through it all, Catherine never spoke Oliver's name aloud again. Not out of anger, but out of necessity. He had erased himself. And in the space he left behind, she had built a life, fragile, imperfect, but fiercely alive. Oliver Hale had no reason to suspect that anything about this particular Thursday would be different. His schedule, as always, was tightly packed: meetings with international investors in the morning, a board call over lunch, and then a short, unplanned visit to one of his company's satellite offices in Brooklyn to finalize a last-minute contract. It was supposed to be quick. In and out. A formal handshake, a signature, and then back to his world of sleek offices and private cars. He barely registered the details of the building when he arrived. It was a modest structure by his standards, too plain, too narrow, with the smell of cleaning chemicals lingering in the halls and the buzzing of old fluorescent lights overhead. He hated inefficient lighting, but it was a temporary stop, barely worth his attention. His assistant trailed behind him, murmuring updates about stock trends and pending approvals, but Oliver wasn't listening. His mind was elsewhere, preoccupied with an upcoming merger that had the potential to double his market position in Europe. He walked with the confidence of someone who expected the world to make room for him, eyes forward, shoulders straight, unaware that the most important moment of his life was waiting just a few steps ahead. As he turned the corner into a wide hallway near the executive conference room, something on the floor caught his attention. A small figure crouched low, scrubbing the tile with exaggerated determination. At first, he barely looked, just another maintenance worker, likely someone's underpaid child dragged along for the day. But as he passed, the girl glanced up. Their eyes met. And he stopped walking. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7. Her hair was dark brown and long, tucked behind her ears in loose waves. Her hands were covered in bright yellow cleaning gloves that looked far too big for her tiny wrists. And her eyes, those unmistakable brown eyes, froze him where he stood. They were his eyes. His mother's eyes. Eyes that had stared back at him in the mirror every morning of his life. The recognition hit him with such force that he actually felt his chest tighten. He turned to face her fully, stunned into stillness, but before he could speak, someone else stepped into view. A woman emerged from a nearby supply closet, her belly round beneath a loose shirt, her posture tired, her hands carrying a bucket of water. She looked up casually, expecting to see no one of consequence, and then her gaze locked on his. Her entire body went rigid. It was Catherine. Pregnant. Pale. Older. But unmistakably her. And in the split second that followed, Oliver felt time collapse around him. Every breath left his lungs in a single sharp exhale. The hallway blurred. The sound of his assistant's voice faded behind him. Catherine stood frozen. She hadn't seen him in over 6 years. Not in person. Not in photos. She had avoided every article, every news segment, every mention of his name. And now here he was, towering in front of her in a tailored blue suit, looking at her like he'd just seen a ghost. Oliver opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He looked from her to the girl, then back again. It was obvious. The shape of the child's face. The tilt of her chin. Her eyes. His eyes. He stepped forward slowly, his voice barely a whisper. Catherine? She didn't answer at first. Her throat worked around silence. Then, with barely a breath, she said his name. Oliver. He crouched down in front of the girl, the motion unpracticed, stiff, as if his body didn't remember how to do it. He stared at her for a long moment before speaking. Why are you cleaning the floor? The girl looked up at him without fear or hesitation. I'm helping my mom, she said simply. She's tired. Her voice was soft, but full of clarity. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't unsure. She was explaining a fact that, to her, needed no justification. Oliver looked back up at Catherine. She was staring at him, tears forming slowly in her eyes but not yet falling. Her body trembled with effort to hold herself together. She's mine? He asked, already knowing the answer. Catherine nodded once, her lips parting as if she might speak, but the words never made it out. Instead, she bent down and pulled her daughter gently toward her, holding her close. Sophie, she said, brushing the girl's hair away from her face, this is someone I used to know. Sophie looked at her, then back at Oliver. You look like me, she said, studying his face. And then Catherine said nothing more. She couldn't. Her voice broke in her throat, and tears finally spilled down her cheeks as she held her daughter close. She wasn't crying from weakness, or regret, or even pain, it was something more complicated. A wave of everything she had carried alone for years suddenly catching up to her in one unbearable moment. Oliver remained on his knees, staring at them both, the weight of what he'd lost settling into his bones. He didn't know yet what to say, what to ask, or what to fix. All he knew, in that moment, was that the life he had built without them was nothing compared to the one he had unknowingly abandoned. The air in the small storage room was thick with unspoken words. Cleaning supplies lined the walls, the faint smell of bleach clinging to every surface. A single dim bulb buzzed overhead, flickering occasionally, casting uneven light over the cracked linoleum floor. Catherine stood near the doorway, one hand protectively resting on her pregnant belly, the other gently placed on Sophie's shoulder. Oliver sat on an overturned plastic bucket, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the floor like a man trying to piece together a shattered version of reality. No one spoke for a long time. The silence wasn't awkward, it was heavy, like the room itself had been waiting for this conversation for years. Outside, muffled voices from the office buzzed in the background, a sharp contrast to the fragile stillness between them. When Oliver finally raised his head, his expression was unreadable. It wasn't the face of a confident businessman or a man used to power. It was someone stripped bare. "She's mine," he said, more to himself than to Catherine. "I knew it the second I saw her eyes." Catherine didn't flinch. She looked at him with a mixture of exhaustion and strength, the kind you earn from surviving heartbreak with no one to witness it. "Yes," she said quietly. "Her name is Sophie." He repeated the name in a breath. "Sophie. How old is she?" "6, Catherine answered. "She was born a few months after you left." That hit him harder than he expected. He leaned back slightly, inhaling sharply. "So when you told me you were pregnant, you didn't want the child," she said, cutting in gently but firmly. "You made that clear. I wasn't going to beg you to stay. You told me I was broken, Oliver. And then you walked away. You didn't ask if there was a chance. You didn't wait." He opened his mouth to defend himself, but closed it again. What could he possibly say? That he was scared? That he thought walking away was logical? The excuses felt hollow before they even reached his lips. Instead, he asked, "Why didn't you tell me again later? After she was born?" Catherine's jaw tightened. "I thought about it. Many times. But I knew you'd moved on. I saw your face in magazines, standing next to models, shaking hands with politicians. You were fine, thriving. And I was scrubbing floors with a baby who cried all night. I didn't want to be someone you helped out of guilt or obligation. Sophie deserved more than that." Oliver looked at her, really looked at her for the first time since that day he left. The faint lines around her eyes, the tired slope of her shoulders, the quiet defiance in the way she stood her ground, none of it diminished her. In fact, she looked stronger than he remembered. Real. Unbreakable. He shifted forward, his voice quieter now. "Is she, okay? Healthy? Happy?" Catherine glanced down at Sophie, who had wandered a few feet away to play with an empty spray bottle, completely unaware of the storm brewing in the air above her. "She's kind. Smart. She loves books, and she asks questions I don't always know how to answer. She's curious about the world. And she's been helping me since she could walk." "I saw that," Oliver murmured. "She shouldn't be cleaning floors." "No, she shouldn't," Catherine said, her voice carrying a flicker of anger now. "But she does. Because she sees me come home every night barely able to stand, and she wants to help. She's never had the luxury of being just a kid." Oliver rubbed his hands over his face. Shame settled into his chest like a stone. "I didn't know. I had no idea. You didn't want to know, Catherine corrected. You made a decision, and you closed the door. I wasn't going to beg you to reopen it. The tension in the room hung like fog, but something else crept in too, something quieter. A crack in the wall. A moment of possibility. Oliver looked up at her again, and this time, the question in his eyes wasn't about the past, it was about the future. Can I do something? He asked carefully. Anything. For her. For you. Catherine didn't answer right away. Her instinct was to shut him down, to protect herself, to protect Sophie. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the way his voice cracked when he spoke her daughter's name. Maybe it was the flicker of recognition in Sophie's face when she looked at him. Maybe it was the fact that she was tired, so tired, of carrying everything alone. I don't need your money, she said finally. We're not a charity case. I know, he replied. That's not what I'm offering. She looked at him for a long time, weighing the risks of letting him back into their lives, of giving him access to a child he once rejected. But she also saw what he hadn't said, that maybe, just maybe, he had changed. And Sophie, sweet and open-hearted Sophie, had a right to know where she came from. You can start, Catherine said slowly, by showing up. Not for me. For her. No promises. No big gestures. Just, show up. Oliver nodded, something in him shifting. Okay. I will. And for the first time in years, Catherine didn't feel alone in the room. She didn't forgive him. Not yet. Maybe not ever in the way he might hope. But in that quiet storage room, surrounded by mop buckets and broken trust, something small and fragile began to grow, the possibility of repair. Oliver didn't return to his sleek office after that meeting. He cancelled the rest of his day, something he never did, and sat in his car for nearly an hour without speaking. The driver didn't ask questions, Oliver simply stared out the window at the passing world, a silent storm behind his eyes. Everything looked different now, like a curtain had been pulled back on the life he thought he'd built. He wasn't thinking about contracts, expansion, or branding. He was thinking about a little girl in yellow cleaning gloves who had his eyes and called his ex-wife Mama, with such love it made his throat close. True to his word, he showed up the next day. And the one after that. At first, Catherine met him with cool, measured silence. She didn't try to stop him from seeing Sophie, but she also didn't invite him in. Their interactions were short, polite, and tightly controlled. He didn't push. He understood that trust wasn't something you demanded, it was something you rebuilt piece by piece, especially after you had broken it with your own hands. Sophie greeted him each time with cautious curiosity. She didn't yet call him anything specific, not Dad or Oliver, but she talked to him, asked questions, showed him her favorite books and toys, and introduced him to her version of the world with the kind of honesty only a child could give. One afternoon, while sitting on the front steps of the building eating ice cream, she pointed to the sky and asked, "Do you think the clouds talk to each other when we're not looking?" He didn't know what to say at first. No one had asked him something so purely imaginative in decades. After a pause, he replied, "I hope so. I bet they say things we'd never understand." She grinned, and in that smile, he saw every reason to keep coming back. He started small. He offered to help with errands. Picked up groceries when he could. Paid for Sophie's school supplies discreetly, never making a show of it. Catherine refused his attempts to give her money directly, but she eventually allowed him to contribute in quiet ways, when it was clearly for Sophie's benefit and not to ease his own conscience. Slowly, something began to shift. The tension between them didn't disappear, but it softened. They were no longer enemies standing on either side of a broken history, they were two people orbiting the same child, trying to protect her from a world that hadn't made it easy. Catherine still worked long hours. Her pregnancy progressed with complications that made everything harder, her back ached constantly, she could barely sleep, and stress hung over her like a second skin. One night, after walking her home from a late shift, Oliver offered to stay and help put Sophie to bed. Catherine hesitated, then nodded, too exhausted to argue. Inside the apartment, everything was small and lived in. Crayons were scattered on the kitchen table, children's books stacked unevenly by the couch. It wasn't luxurious, but it was filled with love. He could feel it in the walls, in the quiet routines, in the way Sophie curled up in bed and waited for her mother's goodnight song. That evening, after Catherine had sung softly and turned off the light, she found Oliver in the kitchen, washing dishes without being asked. It was such a foreign image, him, sleeves rolled up, quietly scrubbing a cereal bowl, that she didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "You don't have to do that," she said, leaning against the doorway. He didn't stop scrubbing. "I know. But I want to." They stood in silence for a moment, the low hum of the refrigerator the only sound between them. Then she said quietly, "You really hurt me." His hands stilled, but he didn't look up. "I know. I don't think I'll ever fully forget what you did," she continued. "I don't say that to punish you. Just so you understand." He nodded. "I do. And she'll ask one day," Catherine added. "About why you weren't there. I won't lie to her." "You shouldn't," he said, finally meeting her eyes. "She deserves the truth. Even if it makes her hate me for a while." Catherine studied him. There was no trace of the man who had once walked away from her like she was a problem to be solved. This Oliver looked smaller somehow, not physically, but emotionally, like someone who had finally come face to face with the cost of his choices. And maybe, she thought, that was the only real starting point for any of this to work. Over time, Oliver became part of their rhythm. Not every day, but often. He walked Sophie to school when Catherine couldn't. He read to her at night when her mother was too tired to keep her eyes open. He started cooking, terribly at first, but improved with practice. He learned to make Sophie's favorite pancakes shaped like animals, and he laughed every time she insisted hers looked more like a cloud than a bear. And slowly, like a flower growing through cracked concrete, something began to bloom between them. Not romance. Not yet. But trust. And in a life that had once been defined by absence, that trust felt like the beginning of something worth believing in. By the time Catherine entered her final trimester, everything in her life was both more fragile and more full than it had ever been. She moved slower, rested less, and carried her exhaustion like an invisible weight. Yet for the first time in years, she wasn't carrying it alone. Oliver had integrated himself into their days with a quiet persistence that didn't ask for praise or recognition. He just did things. He showed up at the clinic on appointment days without being asked, bringing a smoothie in one hand and a stack of insurance paperwork in the other. He waited outside exam rooms, listened carefully to the doctor's updates, and asked questions Catherine was often too tired to think of herself. Their arrangement wasn't perfect. There were awkward moments, silences that still held old pain, and days when Catherine looked at him and wondered how they had ever fallen so far apart. But then she would catch him kneeling on the floor, helping Sophie with a school project, or humming one of her lullabies under his breath while folding laundry, and something in her heart would ease. He wasn't pretending anymore. He wasn't performing. He was simply trying. Sophie, for her part, began to warm to him completely. She still didn't call him Dad, but her questions about him shifted from curious to comfortable. She asked if he had pets when he was a kid, what his favorite ice cream flavor was, and whether he thought babies could understand jokes. She would sometimes sit beside him on the couch, resting her head against his shoulder like she had always belonged there. And he never pushed her for more. He let her take the lead, knowing that love wasn't something you claimed, but something you earned. One evening, a week before Catherine's due date, she went into early labor. The pain hit her like a sudden wave, sharp and deep. She was folding clothes in the living room while Sophie colored at the table, and she gasped so loudly that the crayon dropped from her daughter's hand. Panic rose in Catherine's throat, but she didn't let it take over. Instead, she reached for her phone with trembling fingers and dialed the one number she now trusted without hesitation. Oliver picked up on the first ring. "It's time," she said, barely able to get the words out. "I'm coming," he said without pause. "Just hold on." He arrived at the apartment in less than 15 minutes, his car double-parked with the hazard lights blinking. He rushed upstairs, helped Catherine into her coat, and gently guided her down the steps while trying to stay calm. Sophie clung to his other hand, her eyes wide and filled with worry. "Is Mommy going to be okay?" she asked, her voice small. "She's going to be fine," Oliver told her, and though fear curled in his chest, he made sure she heard only confidence in his voice. "We're going to take care of her together." At the hospital, time became a blur. Nurses moved swiftly, machines beeped, and Oliver found himself pacing again, just like he had 6 years ago, only this time, he wasn't walking away. He was waiting. He was present. And when the doctor finally emerged and told him everything had gone well, his knees almost gave out from relief. He was allowed into the recovery room a short time later. Catherine looked pale but strong, her hair clinging to her forehead, her eyes heavy with fatigue. She held a bundle wrapped tightly in white cloth, the smallest, most fragile thing he had ever seen. Catherine looked up at him. "It's a girl," she said quietly. He walked closer, slower than he needed to, as if each step was a privilege. He leaned over and looked down at the newborn. Her face was pink and soft, her tiny hand curled near her mouth. He could barely breathe. "She's beautiful," he whispered. Catherine nodded, tears sliding down her temples. "Do you want to hold her?" The question made his heart thud like a drum. He didn't trust his voice, so he simply nodded. She gently placed the baby in his arms, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. The hospital room faded. The noise vanished. All that remained was the weight of the child in his arms and the quiet awe that came with it. He looked at Catherine, his voice cracking when he finally spoke. "Thank you. For letting me be here. For not shutting the door." She reached out and touched his hand, not as a lover, not yet, but as something deeper, someone who had seen him at his worst and was now seeing him try to become his best. Later that night, after Catherine had fallen asleep and the baby lay quietly in her bassinet, Oliver sat by the window holding Sophie on his lap. She was drowsy, her head resting on his chest, one hand clutching his shirt. "Is she really my sister?" she asked. He kissed the top of her head. "She really is." Sophie yawned. "She's lucky. She'll get to grow up with you." He swallowed hard, emotion thick in his throat. "And I'm lucky I still get to be here for you." That night, as New York glittered outside the hospital window, Oliver made a silent promise, not just to the newborn girl, or to Sophie, or to Catherine, but to himself. That he would never again confuse success with presence, nor achievement with love. He had walked away from everything once. Now, all he wanted was to keep walking forward, one real step at a time, with them. The days following the birth were filled with a delicate, beautiful chaos. The apartment now echoed with the soft cries of a newborn, the shuffle of tired feet on hardwood floors, and the occasional clatter of a dropped bottle or toy. Catherine, though experienced in quiet resilience, found herself overwhelmed in a way she hadn't been with Sophie. Her body was slower to recover this time. The exhaustion dug deeper, and the demands of a newborn layered atop the needs of a curious, emotional 6-year-old left her no time to breathe. But unlike the first time, she wasn't alone. Oliver stayed. Not just physically, but in all the ways that mattered. He brought breakfast in the mornings and tucked Sophie into bed at night. He learned to change diapers and swaddled the baby like his life depended on it. When Catherine was too tired to stand, he carried the laundry downstairs himself. When she fell asleep mid-conversation on the couch, he pulled a blanket over her shoulders and sat quietly beside her, just in case she woke up disoriented. The baby, whom Catherine named Grace, seemed to already know her father's voice. When Oliver whispered to her during late-night feedings, she settled more quickly, as though comforted by the low rumble of a man who was trying, every minute, to make up for years lost. Sophie, ever observant, noticed the shifts first. She saw how Catherine smiled more, how the tension in her shoulders eased, how laughter returned in small bursts, especially when Oliver accidentally spilled formula all over his shirt and panicked like a rookie. She began calling him Dad one morning without warning. She had been helping him stack clean dishes, standing on a chair beside the sink, when she said, "Dad, can I paint later?" as casually as if she had said it 100 times before. Oliver froze. The dish in his hand trembled just slightly, and he turned to her slowly, searching her face. "What did you call me?" he asked, not out of disbelief, but out of fear that he had imagined it. Sophie glanced up at him, a bit confused. "Dad," she repeated. "Is that okay?" He knelt down, drying his hands on a towel, and looked her in the eyes. "It's more than okay," he said, barely able to speak. "It's the best thing anyone's ever called me." From that moment forward, something solidified. Their dynamic began to evolve, not just as individuals surviving, but as a unit becoming something whole. The apartment started to feel less like a stopgap and more like home. Oliver even moved in officially 2 months later, after Catherine agreed it no longer felt like he was just visiting. They rearranged the furniture together, cleared space in the closet, and repainted the bedroom walls a soft warm gray. It wasn't grand or luxurious, but it was theirs. Catherine still kept a part of herself guarded. Forgiveness, she told him once, wasn't a gift given easily. It wasn't a door swung open, it was a window slowly cracked to let air in, inch by inch. Oliver understood. He didn't pressure her. He just remained steady, proving his presence every day with actions, not promises. One weekend, they took a rare trip to the countryside. It was nothing extravagant, just a small rented cabin near a lake. Sophie caught fireflies in a jar, Grace slept peacefully in her carrier, and Oliver made dinner over a crackling fire pit, burning the hot dogs twice before laughing at himself. That evening, as the three of them sat on a blanket under a dome of stars, Catherine rested her head on his shoulder for the first time in years. They said nothing. They didn't need to. He wrapped an arm around her gently, holding her close, as Sophie dozed off beside them and Grace shifted softly in her sleep. The night was cool and quiet, and the air smelled like pine and ash. Oliver tilted his head back to look at the stars and realized that this quiet, imperfect moment, was more meaningful than any business deal he had ever chased. He had spent so long running toward success, convinced it would fix what was broken inside him. But no boardroom, no $1 million contract, no headline had ever brought him peace. What did bring him peace was right here, a woman who had every reason to shut him out but chose instead to let him rebuild, a daughter who forgave without needing an apology spelled out, and a newborn who didn't yet know the world but already trusted him to be part of hers. That night, as he carried both girls back inside and helped tuck Sophie into bed, Catherine stood in the doorway and watched him. Something in her heart softened further. Maybe she would never forget the pain. Maybe it would always live in some small part of her. But now, it lived beside hope. And that was enough. Oliver kissed Grace's forehead before turning off the light. When he turned to Catherine, he didn't speak, but his eyes said everything. She took his hand and led him to bed, not as a test or a gesture, but as a beginning. It wasn't a perfect love story. But it was real. And for them, that made it more powerful than anything either of them had ever known. A year passed. A year that changed all of them in quiet, meaningful ways. The small apartment where Catherine once held her world together with duct tape and grit was now a different place, not because it was bigger or richer, but because it breathed differently. There was laughter in the corners now, dishes in the sink that belonged to more than one adult, baby toys underfoot, books piled in places they didn't belong, and sticky notes on the fridge with reminders not just of groceries, but of birthdays, school projects, and dinner ideas. Life had settled into a new rhythm, one not born from survival, but from something resembling peace. Oliver continued to show up, not out of guilt or obligation, but out of a deep, grounded desire to be present. He attended every school play, even the ones where Sophie had one line and stood nervously in a paper hat. He paced hospital corridors during Grace's first cold and stayed up all night when she teethed through a fever. He folded tiny clothes without being asked, read bedtime stories even when he was exhausted, and asked Catherine how she was feeling even when she pretended she was fine. He no longer lived by calendars and performance reports, he lived by the soft breath of a newborn on his chest, by the sound of Sophie's feet running to greet him at the door, by the way Catherine let her guard down just a little more each night. Catherine, too, had changed. The weariness in her posture had slowly lifted. The deep, permanent frown lines between her brows had softened, replaced by an ease she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. She returned to her art, a part of herself she had buried under responsibility and exhaustion. She painted late at night after the girls were asleep, and Oliver would sometimes wake up to find her sitting on the floor with brushes in her hand, the smell of acrylic in the air, her fingers stained with color. She wasn't doing it for money or recognition. She was doing it because it reminded her that she was still her own person, one who had dreams beyond motherhood and memory. One evening, as the spring rain pattered gently against the windows and the girls slept upstairs, Oliver sat at the kitchen table, staring at a small box in his hand. It wasn't an impulse decision. He had thought about it for weeks, not because he needed to be forgiven or because he wanted to fix the past, but because he finally understood what commitment meant. It wasn't about making grand promises or saying the perfect thing, it was about waking up every day and choosing the people you love over everything else. He didn't want to erase what had happened. He wanted to grow from it. To plant something in the soil they had both bled into and see what might bloom. He found Catherine in the living room, folding laundry with her hair tied up messily, wearing an old hoodie that still had paint smudges near the sleeves. She looked up and smiled at him in a way that still managed to unsettle him in the best possible way. It was love, but not the kind that came easy. It was love with history behind it, the kind that had been earned in scraped-together dinners and quiet forgiveness. "I know this isn't a moment out of a movie," he said, sitting across from her and placing the box gently on the table between them. "And I know we didn't get here the way either of us imagined. But I'm not asking you to forget. I'm asking if you'll let me be your future." Catherine looked at the box, then at him. She didn't rush. She didn't cry. She simply reached for his hand, held it, and nodded. "You already are." There was no fanfare. No dramatic music. Just two people sitting across from each other, choosing each other again, this time with eyes open and heart scarred but beating steady. In the months that followed, they didn't have a lavish wedding. They held a small ceremony in the park where Sophie once learned to ride her bike. Friends, a few family members, and neighbors gathered with picnic blankets and baskets, and Grace babbled through the entire vow exchange. Sophie stood beside them, holding the rings and grinning from ear to ear, proud in the way only a child who feels deeply can be. As Oliver read his vows, he looked at both girls and said, "I promise that no matter where life takes us, I'll never walk away again. I'll stay. I'll show up. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." Catherine's vows were simpler, but no less powerful. She said, "We built this from nothing. And I've never loved anything more." They signed the papers on a picnic table, kissed while Grace cried in the background, and danced slowly under a tree without music while Sophie twirled in circles around them. That night, as the sun dipped below the city skyline, they held hands and walked home together, Catherine, Oliver, Sophie, and Grace, no longer a family built on what was lost, but one rising from what they had chosen to rebuild. And it was enough. More than enough. To me, the ending of this story isn't about perfection, it's about redemption that feels earned, and love that grows through pain rather than avoiding it. It doesn't offer a fairy tale escape or a clean slate. Instead, it honors the complexity of real healing. Oliver doesn't become a hero overnight. He becomes a father and a partner by choosing to stay, by showing up over and over, even when it's uncomfortable or humbling. That's what makes his transformation believable. Catherine's journey is just as powerful. She never needed to be saved. She built a life from the ground up with grit and grace. What makes her arc so satisfying is that she learns to let someone back in, not because she needs help, but because she's strong enough to forgive without forgetting. Sophie, in many ways, is the heart of it all. Her innocence holds the weight of the past without being broken by it. Through her, we see that family isn't built solely on blood, it's built on presence, repair, and love chosen every single day. This isn't a story about second chances falling from the sky. It's about what happens when someone actually earns one, and what kind of beauty can grow from the broken ground. She sang on a street corner with a toy microphone, blind to the world, until a billionaire heard her voice, uncovered her secret, and everything changed. Morning in Manhattan buzzed with the usual rhythm of honking taxis, crisp suits, and clacking heels. People rushed past towering glass buildings, coffee in hand, lost in their schedules and deadlines. Among them walked Michael Stewart, a man whose face had appeared on magazine covers under titles like America's Youngest Self-Made Billionaire and The CEO Who Never Sleeps. Dressed in a tailored light blue suit that subtly hinted at wealth without screaming it, he strode through the chaos with calculated purpose, a man whose entire life was ruled by structure and efficiency. His brown hair was neatly combed, his light blue eyes sharp and alert. He checked his smartwatch as he passed through the crowd, already thinking 3 meetings ahead. For Michael, time was capital, and every moment spent idle was a moment wasted. He didn't see the point in small talk or casual detours. The world was a competition, and he had spent his life learning how to win it. But just as he turned the corner near 57th Street, something unusual caught his attention. A sound. No, a voice. Soft, melodic, impossibly clear, rising above the hum of traffic and the chatter of morning commuters. It was a child's voice, singing, not screaming or begging, as one might expect in a city used to street performers, but singing with grace and control that made him slow his pace without realizing it. The song wasn't familiar, but the way it was delivered stopped him in his tracks. It was hauntingly beautiful, full of emotion that didn't belong in a child's voice. For a man who sat in boardrooms with Fortune 500 executives and heard polished elevator pitches daily, this sound, raw and honest, hit something inside him he hadn't felt in years. Michael turned his head, scanning the sidewalk, and then he saw her. A little girl, no more than 6, standing near a lamppost with a plastic pink microphone in her hand. She wore a bright pink dress that made her stand out even among the city's colorful crowd. Her long brown hair curled slightly at the ends, and her face was tilted slightly upward, her lips moving delicately with each note. People had gathered in a small circle around her, some recording, some smiling. Others just stood silently, caught in the spell she cast with her voice. Michael found himself stepping closer, drawn in by something he couldn't name. He stood at the edge of the circle and watched her. She wasn't performing like someone taught to entertain. She was sharing something real, something unfiltered. As she sang the final line, her small voice trembled ever so slightly, but she held it, strong and pure. Then silence fell. The crowd clapped, cheered softly, a few people even wiped away tears. She didn't bow, didn't move. She just stood there and smiled gently into the air, unmoving, eyes focused on nothing in particular. Michael blinked, suddenly aware that he had stopped walking, that he was standing still for the first time that morning. And something about that moment, about her, made him forget where he was going. Michael slowly approached the girl, weaving through the thinning crowd as people moved on with their day, glancing back one last time as if reluctant to let go of whatever they had just experienced. She remained where she was, still holding the plastic pink microphone, her face glowing with quiet joy. There was something almost surreal about the way she stood there, so small and alone, and yet completely self-contained, as if the city around her didn't exist. Michael paused a few feet away, not wanting to startle her. Up close, she looked even younger, maybe 5, 6 at most, and now that the performance was over, he could see the subtle signs of wear, the slight fraying of her dress hem, the tiny scuff on her shoes, the faint smudge of dirt on her cheek that hadn't been wiped clean. He crouched down a little so he wouldn't tower over her and offered a warm but cautious smile. "You have a beautiful voice," he said gently. "Truly, it's incredible." The girl turned her head slightly in his direction, her smile widening. "Thank you, sir," she replied, her tone polite and calm. Michael noticed then, really noticed, that her eyes didn't focus on him. They didn't flicker to his face or his expensive suit, or the watch that cost more than most people's cars. They stared just past him, bright but vacant, and it hit him in a way he wasn't prepared for. Before he could say another word, she added with complete sincerity, "I'm sorry if I didn't look at you. I'm blind." The sentence landed with stunning clarity. Michael felt something tighten in his chest. He had come across countless people in his life, ambitious, desperate, cunning, but never had he heard such a simple truth delivered with so much peace. There was no bitterness in her words, no shame or hesitation. Just fact. He swallowed, searching for something to say. "You don't need to be sorry for anything," he said quietly. You sing like the world is yours." She giggled softly. "I like to think it is. Even if I can't see it." For a moment, Michael just looked at her. This child, in a pink dress, with a toy microphone, standing on the corner of a New York street, she didn't have sight, didn't have wealth, and clearly didn't have much in the way of material comfort. But she stood taller than most adults he knew. Her voice wasn't just something beautiful. It was defiant. It was full of life. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lily." "Lily James," she answered, tilting her head slightly. "And I'm 6.5. I count the half because it matters." Michael smiled in spite of himself. "Of course it does. Half a year is a big deal when you're 6. She nodded solemnly, as if he'd just passed a secret test of logic. "Exactly. Grown-ups never get it." He laughed a little, the sound surprising even to him. There hadn't been many moments lately where he'd felt that kind of genuine warmth in conversation. Everything in his world was calculated, negotiations, contracts, projections. But this? This was something else. Still crouched down, he glanced around. There was no adult nearby who seemed connected to her. "Lily, where's your mom or dad?" "My mom's working. She's in a cafe just down the street," Lily explained. "She drops me off here in the morning. I asked her to. I like to sing for people. I think it helps them feel something nice before work." Michael stared at her, stunned. "You asked to come here?" Lily nodded. "I told her it makes me happy. And I think it makes others happy too. She checks on me during breaks. Don't worry, I'm not alone." "And your father?" he asked, almost afraid to. Her face changed slightly, but her tone didn't. "He left when I was a baby. My mom says he didn't know how to love someone like me." Michael felt the weight of that sentence like a stone to the chest. He had no idea what kind of man could walk away from a child like her, sweet, strong, luminous even in silence, but it lit a fire inside him. He had spent years building companies, changing markets, increasing shareholder value, but he'd never once felt the kind of urgency he now felt to protect someone. "Well," he said after a moment, trying to steady his voice, "you're one of the bravest people I've ever met." Lily beamed. "I don't know about brave. I just really love to sing. And sometimes, when people clap or smile, I feel like I can see it all." Michael stood there in silence, overwhelmed by 1,000 thoughts. He wanted to know more, about her, her mother, their life. He didn't know what this moment meant yet, but something had shifted. Something real. Michael stood for a while longer, watching Lily as she hummed softly to herself, swaying just slightly with the rhythm of her thoughts. She wasn't asking for anything, not money, not attention, not even praise. She was just giving. Offering her voice to a world that often turned its face away from people like her. And somehow, she seemed to expect nothing in return. That fact unsettled him in a way he couldn't fully explain. He glanced down the street in the direction she had vaguely indicated, then back at her. "Would it be all right," he asked carefully, "if I went to meet your mom? I'd like to thank her for letting you sing out here. You've made my day." Lily smiled wide. "Sure. The cafe's called Pearls. It's just 2 blocks that way. My mom's name is Anna. Tell her I'm still being good." Michael nodded and gave her a small wave, though he realized she couldn't see it. He hesitated before walking away, stealing one last glance over his shoulder as she sat cross-legged on the edge of a planter, microphone resting in her lap, her expression calm and thoughtful like someone decades older. She didn't look nervous or bored or anxious. She looked content. At peace. The walk to Pearls was short but heavy. Michael found himself lost in thought, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement in time with 1,000 unspoken questions. Who were these people? Why had this little girl struck such a chord in him, someone who was, by all definitions, emotionally impenetrable? And what did it say about him that a child, blind and poor, had seen through everything he built without ever looking at him? The cafe was modest, nestled between a nail salon and a newsstand. It had old-fashioned charm, with chalkboard menus and the smell of strong coffee wafting out through the open door. He stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling softly. Behind the counter, a woman in her early 30s was wiping down a tray of mugs. She had tired eyes and her hair was pulled back in a quick, practical bun. She moved with the speed and grace of someone used to balancing too many things at once. When she looked up, Michael saw it immediately, the same light blue eyes as Lily's. "Hi there," she said politely, her voice firm but not unfriendly. "Can I help you?" Michael took a slow step forward, unsure of how to introduce himself. "Yes. Sorry to bother you. My name's Michael Stewart. I just met your daughter Lily outside, and I wanted to speak with you. If that's all right." The woman stiffened, her smile faltering for the briefest second. "Is she okay?" Yes, she's more than okay," Michael assured her quickly. "She's incredible. I was just walking to work and I heard her singing. I don't think I've ever heard something quite like that." The woman relaxed slightly but kept her guard up. "She loves singing. Always has. I was going to be a few minutes before I checked on her again." "You said your name is Michael Stewart?" He nodded. She gave a short breath and then something flickered behind her eyes, recognition, maybe disbelief. "Wait. Not the Michael Stewart? CEO of Axon Group?" Michael gave a slightly awkward smile. "That's me. I guess the suit gives it away." She didn't look impressed or starstruck. If anything, her expression turned more cautious. "So, what does a billionaire want with a blind kid singing on the sidewalk?" He admired her directness. He'd dealt with 1,000 people who'd dance around a question like that for hours, afraid to offend. But Anna James didn't have time for games. He respected that immediately. "I don't want anything," he said honestly. I heard her sing and I had to meet the woman who raised her. I don't even know how to explain it. I run companies, I sit in meetings with world leaders and investors. But your daughter's voice, it stopped me in my tracks. It felt like the first real thing I've heard in years." Anna held his gaze for a long moment, her face softening just slightly. "She has a gift. But it's not just her voice. It's her heart. Lily's always seen more than most people do, even without her eyes. Michael nodded, his voice quiet. That's exactly how it felt. Anna looked down at the counter, then back up at him. We're not rich, Mr. Stewart. We're not even stable most months. I work 2 jobs. Rent's high. Her school can't do much for her. And I'm not asking for anything, don't get me wrong. I'm proud. I just want to give her as normal a life as I can. She's never once complained. Not once. Michael felt something shift in him again, like a wall that had stood too long finally giving way. Can I help? He asked carefully. Not in a charity kind of way. But as a person who wants to make sure your daughter has what she deserves. Anna's lips parted slightly, surprised by the directness of his offer. I'm not used to help coming without conditions. There are no conditions, he said, almost more to himself than to her. I just feel like I was supposed to meet her today. And you? They stood in silence for a few seconds, the hum of espresso machines and clatter of dishes filling the space between them. Anna looked at him as if trying to decide whether to trust this strange man in a perfect suit who had stepped so suddenly into their world. Finally, she said, all right. You can start by walking her home with me after my shift. Michael smiled gently. I'd be honored. Michael found himself returning to Pearl's cafe more frequently in the days that followed, though he couldn't fully explain why to himself. He told his assistant to move some meetings around, delegated tasks he would normally never trust anyone else with, and carved out time he didn't have. Each morning, he stopped by to check on Lily and her mother. Each evening, he walked with them part of the way home, often carrying Lily's toy microphone while she held his hand and narrated stories only she could imagine. Anna remained cautious at first, polite but reserved, her body language protective. She'd clearly spent years building a fragile routine to keep her daughter safe, and Michael respected that. He didn't push, didn't pry. He simply showed up, consistently, quietly, and without expectations. And yet, something in him began to change. The silence of his luxury penthouse, once a comforting barrier from the world, started to feel suffocating. His kitchen remained untouched, his calendar full but his life strangely hollow. But when he sat on a bench with Lily and listened to her sing old jazz songs or tell him which color felt like which emotion, that hollow space didn't feel quite so empty. He'd never known how lonely he'd been until he wasn't alone anymore. One night, as they walked down a quieter street after sunset, Lily reached for his hand as naturally as if she'd known him forever. Her tiny fingers curled around his, and without turning her head, she asked, "Did you used to be sad before you met me?" The question stopped him. He looked down at her, her face calm, eyes unfocused but turned up toward the stars. He took a breath before answering. "I think I forgot what not being sad felt like. Until you reminded me." She nodded as though that made perfect sense. "Sometimes I think people get lost. Not on streets, but inside themselves." "And how do you think they find their way back?" he asked. "Someone sings to them," she said simply. "Or holds their hand." Michael looked up ahead at Anna, who had paused by a corner to check her phone. The fading light caught her hair in gold, and for a moment, she looked like something out of a dream he didn't know he'd been having. Later that evening, after walking them all the way to the apartment building where Anna and Lily lived, a small, clean walk-up on the edge of Harlem, she invited him upstairs for tea. It was the first time she'd done so, and Michael accepted, trying not to let it show how much it meant to him. Their apartment was modest and lived in, with hand-drawn pictures on the fridge and a scent of cinnamon that reminded him of something from childhood he couldn't quite place. There were mismatched chairs, a small couch with a worn blanket, and a collection of Lily's storybooks stacked near the window. Everything was simple, but warm, touched with care and attention. He noticed how Lily navigated the space with ease, counting her steps softly under her breath, brushing her fingers along familiar walls and furniture. Anna set a mug of tea in front of him and sat across the small table. She studied him for a moment before speaking. "You don't act like a billionaire," she said finally. Michael chuckled. "What's a billionaire supposed to act like?" "Detached. Distracted. Like you have somewhere better to be," she replied without hesitation. "I did," he said quietly, looking toward the room where Lily was humming to herself, building something with colorful blocks. "But then I met your daughter." Anna looked down, folding her hands. Her voice softened. "You've been kind, Michael. More than kind. But I need to know why. People like us don't usually get help without someone asking for something in return." He met her gaze. "I don't know how to explain it. She got through to me. She reminds me of something I forgot a long time ago. I spent most of my life working to be untouchable. But the first time I heard her sing, I felt everything I'd been avoiding." Anna said nothing for a moment, and then she smiled, small and tired but real. "You know, I think Lily sees people in ways the rest of us don't. She said something about you after the first day you met. She said, 'Mom, I think that man is carrying something heavy, but he doesn't know how to put it down.'" Michael's throat tightened. He hadn't cried in years, but something about that sentence cracked him wide open inside. "I think she's right," he whispered. Anna reached across the table and gently placed her hand over his. It was the first time they'd touched like that, no microphones, no handshakes, no pretense. "You don't have to carry it alone," she said. And for the first time in his adult life, he believed that maybe he didn't. The days turned into weeks, and Michael's visits became not only expected but anticipated. Lily waited for him each morning with her microphone in hand and a new story on her lips. Sometimes, she would sing just for him before anyone else arrived. Other times, she would ask him to describe the faces in the crowd, what colors the sky wore that day, or what buildings looked like as sunlight bounced off their windows. He described everything with an honesty he didn't know he was capable of, trying to give her a version of the world that wasn't only beautiful but true. Michael's presence was no longer a surprise to Anna either. She had grown used to his quiet knocks at their door in the evenings, his laughter at Lily's wild stories, and his hands carefully helping with dishes after dinner, as if he had lived there all his life. The invisible line she had once drawn between their world and his had begun to fade, slowly but surely, like chalk after the rain. One afternoon, Michael arrived at the cafe with a strange kind of energy in his step. He waited for Anna's shift to end, and then, walking with her and Lily toward the park, he gently said he had an idea. Not a business proposal. Not a donation. Just a gift. "I want to organize a performance," he said, glancing at Lily, who was balancing on the edge of the sidewalk, her arms stretched like wings. "Something simple. A little stage, a few musicians. People should hear her sing. Not just by chance on the street, but because they choose to come and listen." Anna looked uncertain. "A public event?" "I don't know, Michael. She's never been on a real stage. That might be too much." Lily, without even pausing her walk, said, "I want to try." Anna looked at her daughter, then at Michael, and finally nodded, though nerves flickered in her eyes. "All right. But only if she wants to." It didn't take long for Michael to put everything into motion. He used one of his company's charity arms to secure a small outdoor venue near Central Park. He hired a few professional musicians who specialized in playing with children. No big lights, no media. Just a small platform, clean sound equipment, and folding chairs arranged beneath strings of warm white lights. He wanted it to feel like magic, but the kind of magic that didn't overwhelm. On the evening of the performance, Michael stood backstage watching Lily stand quietly in her pink dress, her toy microphone replaced with a real one for the first time. Her hands were clasped gently in front of her, her head tilted to one side as she listened to the crowd gathering. Though she couldn't see them, she seemed to sense them, each step, each shuffle, each breath taken in anticipation. "Are you nervous?" Michael asked her, kneeling down beside her. She smiled. "A little. But it's like standing in the dark with music. That's not scary. That's home." When she stepped onto the stage, the audience fell completely silent. There was no announcement, no big introduction. Just a small girl in a pink dress standing under the glow of warm lights. She opened her mouth, and the first note that came out was so clear, so impossibly pure, it pulled something out of every single person in the crowd. There was no showmanship in her performance. No forced smiles or practiced gestures. She simply stood still and let the song live through her. Her voice floated out over the park, rising into the night like something ancient and ageless. Michael didn't sit during the performance. He stood near Anna, who was watching with hands pressed tightly together, eyes glistening with tears. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The way she looked at Lily was enough. It was pride, love, awe, and a kind of heartbreak that only a mother who's seen her child struggle can truly feel. When Lily sang the last note, there was a pause. A stillness. And then the crowd erupted, not in a wild cheer, but a standing ovation full of genuine, soul-deep admiration. Some clapped through tears. Others simply stood with their hands over their hearts, as if unsure how to process what they'd just experienced. Lily smiled and bowed her head slightly, then turned and found her way back to the side of the stage where Michael and Anna were waiting. "That was beautiful," Michael said softly. "I think they felt it," Lily replied, tilting her head toward the sound of clapping. "I hope it made someone less lonely." "It made a lot of people less lonely," Anna said, hugging her tightly. Later that night, after the crowd had dispersed and the lights were being taken down, Michael received a call from one of his assistants. The performance had been recorded, someone from the crew had posted a short clip online. It had gone viral in less than an hour. Millions of views. Comments pouring in. People were asking who the little girl was. Some offered record deals. Others asked how they could help children like her. Michael looked down at Lily, who was curled up on a bench with Anna's coat draped over her, already asleep. He smiled quietly, heart full, the noise of the outside world distant and unimportant. She had no idea the world was already falling in love with her. And he would make sure it never took anything from her she wasn't ready to give. In the days following Lily's performance, everything seemed to change at once. The video had spread far beyond what Michael had imagined. Overnight, news outlets began calling, journalists sent requests for interviews, and emails poured in from people across the country and even overseas. There were talent scouts, music producers, television hosts, and strangers offering everything from scholarships to studio time. But Michael shielded Lily from all of it. He made it clear to everyone that this wasn't a show business story or a quick viral success to be exploited. This was a child who had unknowingly awakened something powerful in people's hearts, and she would not be treated like a product. Still, something unexpected emerged from the surge of attention. A letter arrived at the cafe one morning, addressed to Anna James in careful handwriting. It came from a private clinic in Boston specializing in pediatric ophthalmology and experimental procedures. The doctor who wrote the letter had seen the video and been deeply moved. He had reviewed Lily's condition, they had quietly obtained her medical records through a mutual hospital contact, and believed there was a chance, however small, that her vision could be partially or even fully restored. Anna read the letter 3 times before she handed it to Michael. Her hands trembled slightly, and there was a fragile kind of hope in her eyes that he hadn't seen before, the kind people are afraid to have because it hurts too much to lose. Michael sat across from her in the back corner of the cafe, reading every word carefully, his expression unreadable. "She's already so strong," Anna said quietly. "What if this changes her? What if it fails?" Michael folded the letter and held it in both hands for a moment. "And what if it works? What if she gets to see you for the first time? The world? The sky she sings about every day? Anna looked down at the table, wrestling with the weight of a decision no parent should ever have to make. She had lived so long without letting herself dream of this possibility that the very thought of it felt dangerous. But Michael saw her begin to shift. She was starting to let herself imagine it. Within 2 weeks, they were in Boston. Michael chartered a private flight, made sure Anna and Lily had a suite at a peaceful family lodge near the clinic, and brought in specialists he trusted with his life. The medical team was cautiously optimistic. The procedure would involve a combination of gene therapy and retinal implant surgery. It was long, delicate, and full of risk. The odds of full success were less than 30%. But they weren't zero. The night before the operation, the three of them sat together in the quiet room of the lodge. Lily, seated between Anna and Michael on the couch, seemed calm in a way only she could be. "Are you scared?" Michael asked her, brushing a strand of hair away from her forehead. "A little," she admitted. "But I want to see what music looks like. I think it's made of colors." Anna looked at her daughter, eyes glassy with tears. "Whatever happens, you're still my miracle." Lily turned toward her, reaching for her face with practiced fingers. "And you're still the most beautiful person I've never seen." Michael looked away for a moment, overwhelmed. He stood and walked toward the window, his hands in his pockets. Outside, the lights of Boston glowed dimly, and the night air hummed with a strange, anticipatory stillness. The next morning, Michael paced the hospital corridors like a man lost in his own mind. The procedure was expected to last 9 hours. Anna sat in the waiting area silently, hands folded in her lap, her body still but her eyes constantly shifting to the hallway, hoping for news. Time crawled by in aching increments. Every minute felt like an hour. Michael kept replaying moments in his head, the first time he heard her sing, her smile when she told him she was blind, the way she always seemed to walk like the world was hers even when she couldn't see a step in front of her. He had built empires, spoken at global summits, negotiated billion-dollar deals. But nothing in his life had ever made him feel this helpless. When the door finally opened and the lead surgeon walked in, both Anna and Michael stood up instantly. "She's awake," the doctor said. "The procedure went as well as we could have hoped. We won't know the full results for a few days, but early signs are promising. She's already responding to light." Anna broke into tears, covering her mouth with both hands. Michael felt something loosen in his chest, a knot he hadn't even known was there. The doctor gestured for them to follow, and they walked silently through the long hallway, their steps measured but quick, as if afraid the moment might vanish if they rushed too fast. When they entered Lily's recovery room, she was lying on a bed with bandages over her eyes. Machines beeped softly around her. She looked small, but peaceful. Anna sat by the bed and took her hand. Michael stood beside them, silent, watching. The doctor explained that in a few days, they would remove the bandages. Lily would likely need time to adjust, therapy to learn how to process the visual world, and even then, there was no guarantee. But the chance was real. For the first time in his life, Michael prayed. Not with words or religion or ritual. Just a silent, desperate wish to whatever force might be listening, let her see the world she's been painting with her voice. Let her see her mother. Let her see the light she's always given to others. And in that quiet room, under fluorescent lights and the soft hum of machines, he realized something else too. If she did open her eyes and see for the first time, he wanted to be the one standing right there, holding her hand. Not as a sponsor or a benefactor. As family. The days that followed passed in a haze of waiting, quiet optimism, and cautious preparation. Lily remained calm throughout, far more composed than either Michael or Anna, who took turns sitting beside her bed while she rested. Her bandages stayed in place as the doctors monitored her progress. Every few hours, someone came in to check on her vitals, test her eye responses under the dressings, and chart her healing. They were careful not to promise anything, but they began using the word hopeful more freely, and even that was enough to keep Anna from sinking under the weight of uncertainty. Michael stayed in a nearby hotel but visited the hospital every morning and stayed until late each night. He brought Lily her favorite strawberry yogurt, learned how to play simple card games using textured cards designed for the blind, and read to her from books she already knew by heart. She would often smile and finish sentences before he could, quietly correcting his pacing or tone with the authority of someone who loved stories deeply. On the fourth morning after surgery, the doctors told them the bandages could come off. Anna went pale, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for Lily's. Michael stood at the side of the room, arms crossed, jaw clenched, trying not to show how deeply he was affected. The nurse explained the process: slow, deliberate removal to avoid disorientation. They dimmed the lights and spoke softly, preparing Lily for what was to come. She nodded through it all, holding her mother's hand in one and reaching toward Michael with the other. He stepped forward and took her hand without hesitation. Her fingers closed around his as though it was the most natural thing in the world. "You're here," she whispered. "I told you I would be," he said, his voice low and steady. The nurse began to remove the layers of gauze, slow and careful. Lily sat still, her breathing measured, her face composed but clearly bracing for something she couldn't quite imagine. When the final layer was peeled away, there was silence. The room held its breath. Lily blinked slowly. Her eyes, once clouded and distant, now moved with intention. She squinted against the soft light, her pupils reacting, just slightly at first, then more sharply. Her gaze shifted, uncertain, but searching. The doctor moved his hand gently in front of her face, and for the first time, she followed it. Anna gasped, tears running freely down her cheeks. She cupped her daughter's face and said her name, barely a whisper. "Lily." Lily turned toward her voice, her eyes narrowing, focusing, struggling. She leaned forward, her expression changing from confusion to something like awe. "I see you," she said, the words catching in her throat. "Mom. I see you." Anna collapsed into her arms, sobbing uncontrollably as she kissed her daughter's forehead again and again, repeating thank you over and over like a prayer. Michael stood frozen, his heart pounding so hard it felt like a drum inside his chest. Lily turned her head toward him, still blinking, still adjusting. Her eyes met his. He felt it in his core, not just her vision, but her recognition. She reached toward him, not blindly now, but deliberately. "You look kind," she said with a small, amazed smile. "Your voice is warmer than your face, but I like both." Michael laughed, the sound breaking through the pressure that had been building in his chest for days. He knelt beside her, unable to stop smiling, even as his own eyes welled up. "I've been waiting to see you see," he whispered. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever watched." They stayed in that moment, quiet, raw, sacred. No one moved. The doctors backed away, giving space, and the nurse gently slipped out of the room, leaving them in peace. The soft hospital lights seemed to fade, and time slowed, suspended around that first meeting of eyes and hearts. Later, after the initial whirlwind of joy, medical instructions, and cautious follow-ups, the three of them returned to the lodge for rest. Lily spent hours simply staring at things, marveling at color, light, motion. She was overwhelmed but fearless, walking from room to room and asking questions about everything. She touched her mother's face over and over, comparing it to the one she'd imagined. She stared at Michael as if trying to memorize every detail. One evening, after dinner, she curled up between them on the couch, her head on Anna's lap, her legs stretched across Michael's. She was quieter now, her energy spent from the emotional and sensory overload. "Does this mean I'm different now?" she asked softly. Anna smoothed her hair and said, "You're still you. Just with more ways to see the world." Michael nodded, his hand resting gently on her ankle. And now the world gets to see you too. Lily closed her eyes, not because she had to anymore, but because she wanted to. I think I want to sing again. But this time, I want to sing to the sky. I want to know what blue really looks like when I do. You will, Anna said, her voice full of certainty. And we'll be there with you, Michael added. In the quiet warmth of that room, lit only by a soft bedside lamp, the three of them sat together, no longer a billionaire, a single mother, and a blind child, but something far more rare and unbreakable. They had become a family. The months that followed were filled with firsts, small moments that would have been ordinary in any other child's life, but for Lily, each was a revelation. She saw trees in the fall for the first time, their colors wild and blazing like fire. She ran her fingers across pages in her picture books and now matched images with the words she had memorized by sound. She watched her mother laugh and finally understood the shape of that joy. She traced Michael's face slowly one morning and whispered, "You're not as serious looking as I thought you'd be," making him burst into laughter that came straight from the gut. He'd never laughed like that in his adult life, not until Lily made it natural. She attended therapy sessions several times a week to help her brain process the constant rush of visual information, and even in those settings, she became a kind of miracle. Doctors called her resilient, her therapists called her gifted, and strangers recognized her from the video that had now reached tens of millions. But fame never touched her the way it did others. Lily seemed immune to it, perhaps because she had already known what it meant to be seen in a deeper way, when no one else had ever truly looked. Anna and Michael grew closer with every passing week. At first, it was just proximity, a natural rhythm that formed out of care for Lily, but gradually, it became something more substantial. Michael had never experienced a bond built on silence and understanding, one that didn't rely on grand gestures or hollow promises. He started coming home to Anna and Lily's apartment more often than to his penthouse. He cooked dinner with Anna in the evenings, learned how to braid Lily's hair on the weekends, and stopped answering emails after 8 p.m. without regret. One day, without fanfare, he sold the top floor of his luxury high-rise and quietly bought a 3-bedroom townhouse close to Lily's school and the cafe. He didn't even mention it until Anna saw the keys hanging by the front door and asked, "Is that what I think it is?" To which he simply nodded and said, "It's home, if you want it to be." They moved in together in late spring. The house was filled with sunlight and laughter, a kitchen always stocked with Lily's favorite snacks, and walls that slowly filled with framed drawings, photos, and memories in the making. On the first night they slept there as a family, Lily crawled into their room just before dawn, climbed between them, and whispered, "Now we're really a we." Michael and Anna didn't respond right away. They just reached for her and pulled her close. As summer approached, Michael helped organize a concert, not a viral event or a media spectacle, but something meaningful. He chose the location carefully, an open-air amphitheater surrounded by gardens, with space for children and families to gather. It was part of a new annual charity initiative led by the foundation he had named after Lily's first song, Voice in the Light. The event would support children with visual impairments and disabilities, offering grants, musical instruments, and educational opportunities. Lily, now 7, stood backstage on the night of the concert in a sky-blue dress she had picked out herself. She had learned to choose her own clothes now, her sense of color vibrant and confident. Her long brown hair was brushed and pinned to one side, and she held a real microphone in her hand, not a toy, not borrowed, her own. Michael adjusted the earpiece she wore for audio balance, and Anna kissed her cheek softly before stepping back to give her space. "Are you ready?" Michael asked. Lily nodded. "I'm not just singing tonight," she said. "I'm thanking the world." When she stepped onto the stage, the crowd fell quiet again, just like they had that first night in the park. But this time, she didn't stand still. She looked out at the audience with wide, searching eyes. She saw them. She waved and smiled before bringing the microphone to her mouth. Her voice filled the air, now deeper, clearer, more expressive than ever. She sang of light and color, of things she had once imagined but now knew. She sang of streets and trees and faces she had finally seen. She sang of love, of being found, of what it meant to be whole. The lyrics were her own, simple but piercing, and by the end, the crowd was on its feet, not clapping, but standing in reverent silence, some with tears in their eyes, hands over hearts. Anna stood near the edge of the stage, one hand pressed to her mouth, the other holding onto Michael's. He didn't speak, didn't blink, just kept his eyes on Lily as if trying to memorize every second. When Lily finished and walked back off stage, she was glowing, not from fame or applause, but from peace. In the quiet that followed, she looked up at them both and asked, "Did I do okay?" Anna hugged her tightly. "You did more than okay, baby. You moved the sky." Michael leaned down, cupped her face in his hands, and said, "I've never been more proud of anything in my life." That night, after the stage had been cleared and the lights had gone down, the three of them walked home under a clear sky. Lily looked up at the stars, holding a hand from each of them. "I think I want to be a teacher one day," she said. "Or maybe a mom. Or maybe just someone who helps other kids not be scared." Anna smiled. "You can be anything you want." Michael added, "And whatever you choose, we'll be behind you. Always." Lily squeezed their hands. "You know what I like best," she said. "That when I call you Mom and Dad, it feels right. Like it was always supposed to be that way." They didn't answer. They didn't have to. And as they disappeared down the quiet street, their shadows long and interwoven beneath the soft light of the stars, the world behind them carried the echo of a voice that had once come from the darkness, now fully lit with love. To me, the ending of this story isn't just a conclusion, it's a quiet celebration of what truly matters. It's not about the billionaire, the surgery, or even the fame. It's about three people who, by all logic, should have never met, finding each other in a noisy, indifferent world and choosing to build something soft, real, and enduring. Lily's journey from darkness to light isn't just physical, it's emotional and deeply human. She doesn't become whole because she gains her sight, she was already whole. What changes is that the world finally begins to see her the way she always saw it, with clarity, courage, and wonder. Michael's arc is equally profound. A man who once measured life in profit and performance learns the immeasurable value of presence, care, and connection. His transformation isn't loud or dramatic, it's steady, like trust being rebuilt from the ground up. And Anna, quietly powerful, anchors it all with the kind of love that doesn't ask for recognition, only a chance to keep going. The real beauty of the ending is that it isn't a fairy tale escape, it's a grounded, believable kind of happy. A hope that feels earned. They don't fly off into luxury or perfection. They walk home under the stars, hand in hand, toward a life that's not always easy, but finally, deeply right.